Keith Richards told Chuck Berry, "I'm better than you. What happened next will shock you." The moment that shattered a rock legend's ego and reminded the world that some musical thrones can never be conquered, no matter how famous you become. It was November 15th, 1972, at the Whiskey A Go-Go in Los Angeles. The Rolling Stones were at the absolute peak of their global domination, having just released Exile on Main Saint to critical acclaim and commercial success. Keith Richards, now 28 years old, had spent nearly a decade being called one of the greatest guitarists in rock history. But success can be a dangerous drug, and Keith Richards was completely intoxicated by his own legend. The Stones were in town for 3 sold-out shows at the Forum, and the music industry's elite had gathered at the Whiskey for an after-party that would become the stuff of legend. Chuck Berry, now 46, and still touring regularly, had been invited as a guest of honor, a living reminder of where rock and roll had come from. Keith Richards arrived at the Whiskey like a conquering hero. He was surrounded by the usual entourage of record executives, journalists, and hangers-on who made their living by staying close to rock royalty. The success had changed him from the nervous 19-year-old who had once begged Chuck Berry for guitar lessons into something he'd never been before: arrogant. "Where's the old man?" Keith asked loudly as he scanned the crowded club. He was referring to Chuck Berry, and the dismissive tone in his voice made several people uncomfortable. Chuck Berry was sitting quietly at a corner table, nursing a Coca-Cola and watching the scene with the patient amusement of someone who had seen every type of rock star behavior imaginable. At 46, he had performed for presidents and kings, had influenced every major rock musician of the past 2 decades, and had earned the respect of everyone who understood what real musical innovation looked like. But to Keith Richards, high on his own success and surrounded by yes-men, Chuck Berry looked like yesterday's news. The confrontation began innocently enough. Keith, drink in hand and feeling invincible, approached Chuck's table with the swagger of someone who believed he owned the world. "Chuck Berry," Keith said, his British accent thick with alcohol and attitude. "The man who taught me everything I know about guitar." Chuck looked up with a polite smile. "Keith, congratulations on your success. I've been hearing your music on the radio." Keith's response shocked everyone within earshot. "Yeah, well, maybe it's time we acknowledge that the student has surpassed the teacher," Keith said, his voice carrying clearly over the club's music. "I mean, let's be honest, Chuck. When's the last time you had a #1 hit? When's the last time you sold out stadiums like we do?" The conversation around Chuck's table stopped dead. Several music industry veterans who knew both men looked at each other with expressions of disbelief. Keith Richards, the kid who had once sat at Chuck Berry's feet learning guitar basics, was challenging the master. Chuck Berry's expression didn't change, but those who knew him well could see something shift behind his eyes. He set down his Coca-Cola with deliberate care. "Is that right?" Chuck said quietly. Keith, emboldened by what he mistook for weakness, pressed on. "Look, I'm not trying to disrespect you. You did great things back in the day. But music has evolved, Chuck. We've taken what you started and made it bigger, better, more sophisticated. The Stones sell millions of records. We're international superstars. Maybe it's time to pass the torch officially." The club had grown noticeably quieter. Even the bartenders had stopped making drinks to listen to what was happening at the corner table. Chuck Berry stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. At 46, he was still in excellent physical condition, but more importantly, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone. "Keith," Chuck said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard clearly, "are you challenging me?" Keith Richards, drunk on fame and alcohol, made the biggest mistake of his musical career. "Yeah, Chuck, I guess I am. Let's settle this once and for all, you and me, guitars, right here, right now. Let's see who the crowd really thinks is better." The club erupted in excited murmurs. This was unprecedented, a direct musical confrontation between the founder of rock and roll and one of its current superstars. The manager of the Whiskey, sensing history in the making, immediately cleared a small stage area and had guitars brought in. Within minutes, word had spread throughout Hollywood that Keith Richards had challenged Chuck Berry to a guitar duel at the Whiskey. The club already packed, became impossibly crowded as everyone with any connection to the music industry tried to get inside. Keith Richards took the stage first, and he played like a man possessed. He ripped through Satisfaction, Painted Black, and Jumpin' Jack Flash with all the technical skill and stage presence that had made the Rolling Stones the biggest rock band in the world. The crowd responded enthusiastically, and Keith felt vindicated. He was at the top of his game, playing better than he ever had. When Keith finished his impromptu set, he was grinning with satisfaction. He had just demonstrated to a room full of music industry professionals that he was indeed one of the greatest guitarists alive. "Your turn, old man," Keith said, handing Chuck Berry the guitar with a smirk that he would regret for the rest of his life. What Chuck Berry did next didn't just shock Keith Richards. It reminded everyone in that room why there was only one true king of rock and roll. Chuck Berry took the guitar and spent a moment checking the tuning, his movements unhurried and professional. The club fell completely silent, every eye fixed on the man who had invented the music that Keith Richards had built his career on. Then Chuck Berry began to play. What emerged from that guitar wasn't just music, it was pure, undiluted rock and roll genius. Chuck started with the opening lick of Johnny B. Good, but this wasn't the version that everyone knew from the records. This was Johnny B. Good as only Chuck Berry could play it, with 19 years of additional experience and refinement. His guitar work was absolutely flawless. Every note was precisely where it needed to be. Every bend was perfect. Every rhythm change was executed with the confidence of a master craftsman. But more than technical perfection, Chuck Berry's playing had something that Keith Richards' performance, for all its energy and skill, had lacked soul. Chuck Berry wasn't just playing guitar. He was channeling the entire history of American music through his instrument. You could hear blues, country, jazz, and gospel, all woven seamlessly into what became pure rock and roll. He was telling the story of American music, and everyone in that room was experiencing something they would never forget. But Chuck Berry wasn't finished. Without missing a beat, he segued into Roll Over Beethoven. But again, this was unlike any version anyone had ever heard. Chuck was playing both the rhythm and lead parts simultaneously, something that should have been impossible but sounded effortless in his hands. Keith Richards, standing at the side of the small stage, felt his confident smile fade as he realized what was happening. Chuck Berry wasn't just playing guitar, he was demonstrating that there were levels of musical mastery that Keith hadn't even known existed. The crowd was mesmerized. These were people who had seen every major rock performer of the past decade, but they were witnessing something unprecedented. Chuck Berry, at 46 years old, was playing with a technical skill and creative fire that made everyone else in rock and roll look like amateurs. For his finale, Chuck Berry launched into a version of Sweet Little 16 that was both nostalgic and futuristic. He incorporated elements of every major guitar innovation of the past decade. The distortion techniques that Jimi Hendrix had pioneered, the sustained notes that Eric Clapton had mastered, the rhythmic complexity that Jeff Beck had developed, but he wove them all together in a way that sounded completely natural and effortless. By the time Chuck Berry finished his 20-minute guitar showcase, the entire Whiskey A Go-Go was on its feet in thunderous applause. But more than applause, there was a sense of awe in the room, as if everyone present had just witnessed a master class in musical excellence. Keith Richards stood frozen at the edge of the stage, his face pale and his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. He had just been given a lesson in humility by the man he had foolishly thought he could surpass. Chuck Berry unplugged the guitar and walked over to Keith with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the evening. "Keith," Chuck said quietly, speaking just loud enough for Keith to hear over the continuing applause, "you're a fine guitar player. You've accomplished things that most musicians only dream of. But there's a difference between being successful and being a master. Success comes and goes. Mastery is forever." Keith Richards, his voice barely above a whisper, managed to ask, "How did you do that? How did you make it sound so perfect?" Chuck Berry smiled. But it wasn't a cruel smile. It was the patient smile of a teacher who had just delivered a necessary lesson. "Because I didn't learn to play guitar to become famous, Keith. I learned to play guitar because I loved the music. Everything else, the success, the recognition, the money, those are just side effects. When you play music for the right reasons, for long enough, sometimes you get good at it. The lesson wasn't over. Chuck Berry continued, his voice still gentle but carrying unmistakable authority. You came here tonight thinking that selling records and filling stadiums made you a better musician than me. But music isn't about how many people buy your albums or scream your name. Music is about truth, Keith. And the truth is that you can't fake mastery, you can't buy it, you can't force it, and you certainly can't claim it by putting down someone else. Keith Richards felt tears forming in his eyes as the full weight of his arrogance hit him. He had spent the evening publicly humiliating himself, disrespecting his musical hero, and demonstrating to everyone present that success had made him lose sight of what really mattered. Keith started, but Chuck Berry held up a hand. You don't need to apologize, Keith. You just needed to be reminded of something you once knew. Music is bigger than any of us. The moment you start thinking you've conquered it, it will remind you that you're still just a student. The aftermath of that night at the Whiskey A Go-Go became legendary in rock and roll circles. Keith Richards, humbled and embarrassed by his behavior, underwent what friends later described as a personal and musical transformation. He stopped giving interviews where he compared himself to other guitarists. He began crediting Chuck Berry not just as an influence, but as an ongoing inspiration. Most importantly, Keith started approaching his guitar playing with the humility and respect that Chuck Berry had demonstrated that night. The story of Keith Richards' humiliation became a cautionary tale told throughout the music industry. Young musicians who started believing their own press were reminded of the night that one of rock's biggest stars learned that talent without humility is just noise. Chuck Berry, meanwhile, gained even more respect from his peers for the way he had handled the situation. He could have destroyed Keith Richards that night, could have used the moment to embarrass a younger musician who had disrespected him. Instead, he had delivered a lesson in musical mastery while maintaining his dignity and even showing compassion for someone who had clearly lost his way. The two men never spoke publicly about what happened that night, but their relationship afterward was notably different. Keith Richards treated Chuck Berry with a reverence that bordered on worship, while Chuck Berry seemed to take some satisfaction in knowing that he had reminded not just Keith, but the entire music industry, that some achievements can't be duplicated or surpassed. Years later, when asked about the greatest guitar players of his generation, Keith Richards would always begin his answer with, well, first you have to understand that Chuck Berry is in a category by himself. The rest of us are just trying to learn from the master. The night at the Whiskey A Go-Go also marked a turning point in how Keith Richards approached his own music. The raw arrogance that had defined his early 1970s persona was replaced by a more thoughtful, respectful approach to his craft. He began studying not just Chuck Berry's music, but the blues and country traditions that had influenced Chuck. Keith's guitar playing actually improved after that night. Freed from the need to prove he was better than everyone else, Keith focused on being the best version of himself. The Rolling Stones' subsequent albums showed a maturity and depth that many critics attributed to Keith's renewed respect for the musical traditions that had created rock and roll. Chuck Berry's performance that night became the stuff of legend. Musicians who were there would describe it for decades afterward as one of the greatest guitar performances they had ever witnessed. It was proof that true mastery doesn't diminish with age. It deepens and becomes more profound. The lesson Chuck Berry taught Keith Richards that night resonated far beyond their personal relationship. It became a reminder to an entire generation of rock stars that success and skill are not the same thing, and that no matter how famous you become, there's always more to learn from those who came before you. In the end, Keith Richards' challenge to Chuck Berry didn't prove who was the better guitarist. It proved something more important, that real musical greatness comes not from beating other musicians, but from understanding and respecting the art form itself. Chuck Berry didn't just outplay Keith Richards that night. He reminded everyone present what it means to be a true master of music. The most beautiful part of the story is that Keith Richards learned the lesson. He never again made the mistake of thinking that commercial success equaled musical superiority. Instead, he spent the rest of his career trying to honor the traditions that Chuck Berry had shown him that night, approaching his guitar with the humility and respect that true artistry demands. If this incredible story of ego, humility, and musical mastery moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with any musician who needs to remember that success is temporary, but respect for the craft is eternal. Have you ever had a moment when someone had to remind you what really mattered? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories about the lessons that shaped rock and roll legends.